Earle Arney is a director and MD of the London studio of Arney, Fender, Katsalidis. So, Earle, you've been writing recently in defense of density amid suggestions that one of the results of the COVID-19 pandemic will be a flight to the suburbs, as dense cities are viewed by many as hotspots of viral contagion. So, what in your view is so good about density?
I mean, the impact of density has been a centuries-old debate, and in England, and particularly London, density has had a history which is often associated with Dickensian times of overcrowding, disease, and slums. And I think at the moment, you could almost conceive of where we are as this almost back to the future paradigm, in which the seduction of the suburbs may be mirroring Ebenezer Howard's 1890s Garden City movement, of course advocating the bucolic beauty of those sanctuary suburbs. But given this background, I guess you might ask, why indeed would anyone in their right mind be advocating density, particularly given the terrible consequences of COVID-19? And I think the answer is that density is much maligned and much misunderstood. There's probably three factors that we should consider. It's poor design, not density, that creates impoverished places. And density is sustainable, and when done well, density is livable. So first of all, design, density, desirability. So take, for example, the London borough of Kensington and Chelsea, and it has a population density of about 14,000 people per square kilometre. Now that density is one of the most populous and the highest densities within London, yet it's one of the most sought after boroughs within all of London. There's certainly many impoverished neighbourhoods that don't have a density anywhere near the density of Chelsea. And density is certainly sustainable. Cities are our most sustainable construct. They're the most efficient use of land. And all of that ties into our innate attitudes of care for the earth. And density brings with it many of the things that make cities sustainable in terms of economies of scale, critical densities for essential functions of healthcare and hospitals, and dense communities also support amenities, be it Amazon, restaurants, shops, and so forth. So density also correlates with a significant reduction in car use, and studies since the 1990s mapping dense cities with petroleum use show that those denser cities are certainly much better off in terms of their carbon footprint, and particularly petroleum use. And then the third point I mentioned there was density and livability. And of course, the alternate to density is that we build out and we occupy more land and we consume more resources. Our carbon footprint goes through the roof, and we lose those economies of scales that I talked about. But what about livability? And Melbourne in Australia is a great example of this. Melbourne over the last decade for many of those years has ranked as the most livable city in the world according to The Economist. But it hasn't always been that way. In the 1980s, Melbourne had a population density of about 2,500 people compared to that Kensington and Chelsea of about 14,000. The CBD essentially closed down at 5 p.m, largely no residents in the CBD. But if you fast forward 30, 40 years from there, with coinciding with the ranking of Melbourne, now in the top 10 and often in that top spot, it has a population density that has increased by a factor of 6 to about 16,000 people per square kilometre. And with all of that has come all of those great things we love about cities and the connectivity and the livability. So when done well, density can be really good.
So what do you say particularly to people who suggest that we're going to see a flight out of density as a result of the pandemic?
It's understandable that we're hearing all of this because density has never really been an easy sell, and density has largely been the whipping boy for inequality, urban poverty, substandard design, and poor housing and acute housing need. But density isn't the defining factor in making our cities more vulnerable or less resilient to the pandemic. And we hosted recently a webinar with Dr. Waba from the World Bank. He's a global director there. And he debunked the misunderstood relationship between COVID-19 and density. And his team investigated just under 300 cities and published research that suggests that the inclusive link between density and COVID-19 cases is not, it doesn't tie together and is unfounded. And he also illustrated New York City, which is an outlier to that, as a number of other cities are, where Manhattan, which is the most populous borough of New York City, has fewer COVID-19 cases compared to the suburban boroughs of Queens and Staten Island, and essentially made the case that in many cities, excuse me, density actually aids in making cities more resilient to pandemics in terms of that access to resources and land use. And one final point on that, there's some really interesting research that I think, Peter, you may have pointed to me originally from John Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, who are actually linking density and their measurements, saying it's not about density, it's about connectivity. And their research actually says that denser places are not linked to COVID-19 infection rates. And in some cases, higher density actually lowers those rates of infection. So the data is, density is part of the picture, but it's much, much more nuanced than that very reductive picture.
And so does density mean tall?
Good question. We often think that, don't we? But high density doesn't mean high buildings. And many people will be familiar with Lord Rogers' Urban Task Force from 1999, which very eloquently shifted that debate and made the very clear distinction between high density and height. And of course, suburban areas can occupy homes and driveways, and that same population density within the same land area can also occupy mid-rise scale, such as Notting Hill, shared garden spaces, garden squares, shared amenities, shared services, or the third measure could be towers in a park. So high density doesn't mean height. And there is a place for tall buildings, but density and height aren't mutually inclusive.
We're presuming that the population of London continues to grow after COVID-19 as it was before. We will need to take up quite a lot of land. So you've done a study of available land for development in London and how we could deliver the number of homes London needs without impacting on the green belt. So can you tell me more about your study?
You can probably tell from my accent that I wasn't born in this fair land. And when I decided to become a Londoner over a decade ago, one of the things that attracted me to move my family to London was the Greenbelt. And it offers many of those things that we love. It's got symbols of care of the earth. It helps with our mental health. It enables us to connect with nature. And it also keeps suburban or urban sprawl in check. That also with the great sensitivity that we all have with the housing crisis. And there's no getting away from that. But I think I might be a minority in our profession advocating that the Greenbelt isn't the logical place where we just go and build all of those homes. And in addressing that, we commissioned some research that went to actually interrogate whether there is enough available land resource to accommodate that population demand that you mentioned for 2050, which is about 12.5, 13 million people. So we measured the GLA-defined brownfield sites, the opportunity areas, the housing zones, and we amalgamated all of that area together. And then from that area, we subtracted those areas that were in the Greenbelt. And we also subtracted from that amalgamated area any land that was within 2 kilometres from the existing train station. And the resulting land mass is considerable. It's 250 square kilometres. Now, that's enough land. That 250 square kilometres is enough land to accommodate the 12.5 to 13 million people we need to in current projections by 2050. But there's a catch. You have to build on that land at a density that is about 15,000 people per square kilometre, which is about the density of Chelsea or Notting Hill. Again, some of those really desirable neighbourhoods. So there isn't a land shortage in terms of addressing our acute housing need by any means. To thinking about all of this, no one's happy with lack of homes, and it is an absolute crisis. And I suggest that not many of us are confident in our current system to deliver those homes. And I've suggested in some published research elsewhere that bold challenges require bold moves. And if we think about back to the Olympics and the Olympic Development Authority, which was a special purpose delivery vehicle, that was probably the last time that we effectively delivered mass housing within a very constrained period of time. I would suggest that COVID-19 has suggested that we need to provide great quality and healthy housing for people. We've got the land to do it without building on the green belt. And perhaps now is really the time for some of those bold moves for such a bold challenge that we face.
So yes, one of the benefits of a development corporation is that it can put pieces of land together to create more manageable sites. So in terms of delivering lower rise, high density, you do need to be able to do that, don't you?
You're right. One of the great opportunities, if we were to create a special purpose vehicle, is that we relax the land boundaries. We can have a generalised density. We don't have to be singularly focused on singular blocks of land to provide the pure economic return that developers naturally need. And I think the last thing that we should be doing right now is softening our affordable housing targets. Now's the time where, if anything, we need to be more robust on those. There is a very challenging housing market out there, and to help that development equation, density is a logical lever to actually help provide all of that. And as the World Bank and Johns Hopkins University has proven, if we do density really well and the measures of the Economist in terms of city rankings, we can combine all of these things to even make London better than what it is, and also keep the green belt intact, which I might add, the NHS has calculated that the green belt, the GLA have calculated that the green belt saves the NHS approximately £250 million a year on account of mental health and access to land for exercise. So let's preserve it.
Great. Well, that's a statistic that I hadn't heard before, so I shall definitely borrow that and use it, because that's a great thing to know. So, Earle, thank you very much for our insights and your time, and we look forward to a denser city in the future.
Many thanks, Peter.